The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
This is the ELCA prayer for social justice. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving spirit may move every human heart, that the barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatred cease, and that with our divisions healed, we might live in justice and peace. Through your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Welcome all. I just want to say a word of introduction and then introduce our speaker and leader today. My drive time between Silver Spring, Maryland and Alexandria, Virginia, while I was an interim rector at Emmanuel on the Hill in Alexandria, was much lifted by a podcast that ran at 6 a.m. on National Public Radio called The History Guys. And it's a podcast now that still exists under a slightly different name. And the reason I loved it was one of the folks on it was the then president of the University of Richmond, a Southern historian by trade, and a social historian, which meant he began to really take on the history of the South and explore it from the perspective of everyday people. He was not a historian of great events. He was not a historian of great people, though he knew a lot about them. He was a historian of people and the small things that they write and do in their lives, because that's the real trail and story of who we are as a human family. And both the injustices we perpetrate and the justice we can bring about in those small ways. I love social historians. I have great respect for great people and great events, but it's the small things in life that really tell us so much about how we're to live and be a Christian and faithful Christian community. And along the way, I stumbled on the writing and work of Mary Klein, the diocesan archivist, who is going to tell us the story of how it is that she began to help us read each week about the history of the Diocese of Maryland, especially as it perpetuated racial injustice in all kinds of ways, but also on occasion, racial justice too. And that it's a remarkable story. I know that Mary's work has contributed to the work that Dan Pontius did last year to tell the story, the full story of the history of the cathedral. And I know her work has contributed to a place like Memorial Church in Baltimore, which has had an incredible, life-changing experience as a community willing to take on its own terrible history of racism and slaveholding among its rectors. So, with that, I want to stop talking and turn it over to Mary, and with just simply saying how grateful I am, number one, that she's here, and two, that she does the work that she does. So, Mary, this time is all yours.
Oh, thank you for asking me, and thanks for the introduction. Um, what Mary's referring to is, the diocese has an e-newsletter that goes out every other week, and you may not be receiving that. So that's the first thing I want to tell you is how to get on that mailing list, because the e-news has what's going on in the diocese, but there's also always a little archives piece in there. So if you go on to the website, episcopalmaryland.org, over on the right at the top, there's a little tab for e-news. And if you click on that and go down to the bottom of the page, it says you can subscribe. So if you put in your email address, then you will start getting the e-news. It really keeps you up to date with what's going on in the diocese, and it's pretty informative every other week. So when the new director of communications, when Carrie Graves came on board, she and Jason Hoffman and Jess Pandolfino, who were the team, invited me to be part of that communications team and asked me to start writing an article for every E-News. And eventually, they wanted me to start writing articles pointing to the history of the diocese as regards race. And I started this work in 2006. General Convention passed a resolution wanting to know how did the Episcopal Church and parishes within the Episcopal Church benefit from slavery and from racism. So that was 2006. And that year, the historiographer, who was Kingsley Smith, and I, along with the archivist for the Diocese of Easton and the Diocese of Washington, started researching this topic. Because the Diocese of Easton and the Diocese of Washington were originally part of the Diocese of Maryland. Easton formed its own diocese in 1867 and Washington in 1895. So all the early records of these parishes are in our archives, which is our archives is a wonderful thing. That's another story. But so in 2007, there was a tri-history conference in Williamsburg. The Historical Society of the Episcopal Church, the National Episcopal Historians and Archivists Group, and EWHIP, the Episcopal Women's History Project, met in Williamsburg, and the presiding bishop, Catherine Jeffords Shorey, was there. And Kingsley Smith and I presented this paper that we had written about the Diocese of Maryland and how it had profited from slavery. And if you want to see that document, it's on the website under the Truth and Reconciliation tab. So it's still there. Of course, the General Convention asked every diocese to do this work, and there really has not been a great telling of that story. And then every diocese was supposed to ask every parish to do the same work. And several parishes in Maryland have done a lot of really difficult work, and a lot haven't. But along the line of researching our history and trying to find the truth, which is not always a pleasant task, I've found out all kinds of discoveries, and some of them are really surprising in a good way, and some not so good. But I want to give you a couple of good surprises. When Noble Powell was bishop in the late 40s and 50s, he had wanted to establish a diocesan camp. That was one of his long-term goals. And in 1952, Buckingham School gave its property to the diocese, and Claggett Camp and Conference Center was established. And they immediately started summer programs for kids, and Claggett is one of our great strengths. But I discovered a letter written by a woman in 1955, a very indignant letter written to Bishop Powell, saying that when she dropped her daughter off at Claggett, she noticed 3 Negro girls as campers, and she was writing the bishop to ask him to make sure that our children sleep with those of their own race. So Bishop Powell wrote her back saying he had been born in Alabama, spent his early years in Alabama, so he knew all about segregation. And he said the policy at Claggett is the same as the policy of the diocese, that there's no distinction made at any church gathering to race. He said it's been the same for 25 years, and when they were establishing Claggett, the issue didn't even come up. So he said he has tried to make Claggett Center the spiritual center for all, and has tried to put Jesus Christ at the center of the center. To me, this was rather surprising. Noble Powell's not exactly known for his left-wing leanings or his attitudes on segregation, but he did step up and say, I know about segregation. I was raised in it, and we're not having it here. So that was the 50s. Of course, there are other, excuse me, other people who have stood out in this. Some bishops, some clergy, some lay people. And I've written about all these. Let me start with Harry Lee Dahl, who was suffragan bishop in 1955 to Noble Powell. And then he was installed as the 10th Bishop of Maryland on November 22nd, 1963. And those of you who are as old as I am should remember what happened on November 22nd, 1963. It was the day President Kennedy was assassinated. So his installation as the 10th bishop rather got overlooked. But while he was still suffragan to Noble Powell, he wanted to go to Washington in 1963 to the Martin Luther King March on Washington. And I had heard rumblings from clergy who had been in the diocese for many years that Powell had forbidden him to go. But I couldn't ever find any evidence of that. But I got out Bishop Dahl's diary, and he had an entry on the day that he was wanting to go to the march that he went to the Church of the Redeemer at 7:30 to bless all the people who were going on the bus. And he said, I was unable to attend, but I wanted to be there for this most historic occasion for the country. So that was a pretty good indication that he had been told not to do that. But he was a real advocate for ending segregation and for warning about people who were wanting it to continue. If you remember, George Wallace came to Maryland in 1964 campaigning for president, and Bishop Dahl sent a letter to all the clergy saying, whatever George Wallace is saying, he is a segregationist, and he means it, and stay away from him because he's causing trouble. In 1966, he went before the Baltimore City Council to speak about open housing, along with the Roman Catholic Archbishop Sheehan, and Cardinal Rabbi Schusterman also spoke. And Bishop Dahl told Archbishop Sheehan afterwards that he was jealous because Sheehan was booed for 2 whole minutes when he spoke, and Bishop Dahl only got booed for 1 minute. But he was outspoken in his support for open housing, for ending segregation, and for advocating for empowering African Americans by registering to vote. The 1969 General Convention made $200,000 available to their special fund for a group that was related to James Foreman. I don't know if you remember him, but he spoke at General Convention that year and demanded $500 million in reparations from churches and synagogues for their part in slavery and racism. So General Convention put $200,000 into this fund. And after General Convention, Bishop Dahl came to, again, Church of the Redeemer for an open forum about this issue. And being the leader that he was, he sat in a chair by himself in front of the altar to try and explain this process. And his quote is, "There were at least 1,000 people there, and never in my life have I felt such a wave of pure hatred flow up to me as was there that night." The people in the church booed and jeered him, and after that was over, he got phone calls in the middle of the night and, was harassed for his stand on that. And interestingly, at the end of his life, both Bishop Dahl and Archbishop Sheehan were buried on the same day in 1984, which is interesting. Two people that you might know who have been outstanding in this field are Ron and Mary Miller. Ron Miller was a priest in the diocese, and he died in September of 2019, and he sang in the choir for a few years when he was at the cathedral. And Mary had died in 2018. She had been a member of St. James Lafayette Square for many years. And to show you their impact on this topic, the presiding bishop, Michael Curry, preached at both their funerals. Mary had been working for 815 for the church headquarters, and she was involved in the Episcopal Peace Fellowship, racial reconciliation, marriage equality, and also a group that was organized in the early 60s, the Episcopal Society for Cultural and Racial Unity, which was called ESCRU. And she was the secretary for the Episcopal Peace Fellowship. And Ron and she did amazing work. Quoting Bishop Eloff at the death of Ron, Mary and Ron lived the gospel of social justice, believing in it with their whole beings. So most of the people that I know about are historic figures, but Ron and Mary were today and spent their whole lives working for justice issues. Another person you might never have heard of is John McGilton. He was a priest in this diocese, and he came to the diocese about 1840. He was a very distinguished white clergyman who was a teacher and was actually the first superintendent of public schools in the city of Baltimore. But he began serving at St. James Church. Originally, it was called St. James First African Church in Baltimore, and it was established in 1824, very early, the first African-American parish below the Mason-Dixon line. So McGilton served as their rector. They couldn't pay him, so he taught school to have some income. But he said in 1840, St. James is the only place in the city where colored population, which amounts to over 21,000, are favored with services of the church. So it was the only Episcopal church in the whole diocese that was open to African Americans. It had been held together by a lay reader named Eli Stokes, who was a member of the congregation. for years before McGilton got there. And when Bishop Whittingham came in 1840, a month after he arrived, Eli Stokes wrote him a letter and said that he'd been a candidate for ordination for 2 years, but nobody would oversee his education. Most men at that time read for orders. They couldn't afford to go away to seminary, so the bishop would give them books to read and examinations along the way so they could get their education. And although Stokes had been a candidate for holy orders, nobody was helping him. So Bishop Whittingham took him under his own wing and taught him, gave him books to read, and he was ordained a deacon in 1853 and to the priesthood in 1856. So McGilton was treasurer of the school board starting in 1849, and he was elected the first superintendent of public schools in 1867, but he was immediately fired because he established 2 African-American schools, but the school board refused to pay the salaries of the teachers. So he was dismissed and left for New York. But John McGilton also raised up from the congregation at St. James another priest. His name was Harrison Webb. So he raised up from within their own congregation 2 men who went on to study for the priesthood. And that legacy carried over to George Bragg, who was at St. James Church for many years and was a leading African-American priest in not only the diocese, but in the American church. He came to St. James in 1891 from Virginia, and there were 63 members of the church, and Bishop Perrett was paying his salary because they couldn't afford to. But by 1901, he had called together 180 members, and it kept growing and growing. It's interesting because we know the story of white churches who fled the city when demographics changed. Well, interestingly enough, it also happened to St. James. In 1901, he says they were driven out of East Baltimore by an invasion of its territory by a foreign population. So it went both ways. They sold their church to a synagogue, and they bought a new one at Park and Preston Street. By 1925, St. James had over 500 communicants, and they took advantage of the gradual migration of Blacks into West Baltimore. And the next story goes along with this, and I use it as a cautionary tale. The Church of the Ascension was built in 1867 on Lafayette Square, which was a very prestigious place to live in 1867. It was a huge parish. Its rector, John Lamott, was elected Bishop of Honolulu in 1921. And I have a great photograph of all the clergy and bishops lined up in front of the church to go into his consecration. And standing by a lamppost is the one Black face, George Bragg. Interestingly enough, in 1927, the rector of Ascension wrote in their newsletter, "Our backs are to the wall. We are facing tremendous odds. The Negro invasion has driven our people from their homes. We will not acknowledge defeat." However, they did eventually acknowledge defeat. In 1931, they combined with another parish called Prince of Peace. So it became Ascension and Prince of Peace. People called it APOP. But they eventually decided to leave that neighborhood and move to a less Black neighborhood of Walbrook. Now, if you know anything about Walbrook, you know that Coppin State University is right there. And so they built this new church in Walbrook. But the diocese wanted to buy the Church of the Ascension for Negro work in the area, but didn't have enough money. So Mount Calvary Church loaned them the money for the down payment, and St. James Parish moved into there. In their first services were Easter Day in 1932. So St. James has been in that church since 1932. So Ascension and Prince of Peace went to Walbrook and built a new church, but they decided that was getting a little too Black for them. So again, Mount Calvary bought that church, and one of their missions, St. Mary the Virgin, took over, and it's still there. Ascension and Prince of Peace moved all the way out on Liberty Road in 1953, sensing a shift in the population. But the interesting thing is the rector of Ascension and Prince of Peace sort of bragged about this. He said, "We seek consolation in the fact that we left an Episcopal congregation on both Lafayette Square and in Walbrook." So he thought, I guess, they were doing a great thing. So Ascension and Prince of Peace moved way out on Liberty Road. And in 1985, they had about 50 people on a Sunday, and they closed for good that year. So they kept moving farther and farther and farther out of the city, and their church buildings were taken over by African American congregations, which are still there, and they're long gone. So we have a lot of people over the years who have done a lot of good for race relations. And of course, we have some sad tales as well. But the interesting thing for me for the future is that when we passed the resolution in this year, in 2020, to set aside $1 million for reparations, other dioceses and other church organizations have been calling and asking, how did you get there? So I have already talked to several people in other dioceses, and I'm thinking that more will be coming, to give them an idea of how long it took us to get there and what we had to do to get there, and that there are no shortcuts. One diocese wanted to just take Bishop Sutton's letter that he wrote, his pastoral letter about this, and just co-opt it as their own. And, you know, you can't do that. You've got to do the hard work yourself. There aren't any shortcuts. And, you know, we've been working on this for many years. ESCRU that I mentioned earlier began its chapter here in 1961. So it's been a long time coming. In 62, our diocesan convention asked every parish, school, and institution to state publicly that they accepted any applicant to anything without regard to race or national origin. That came about because diocesan schools, people were challenging whether African Americans were accepted in diocesan schools. We've had a a task force on racism and racial justice since 1991. And in 2003, this diocese required anti-racism training for anybody in an elected capacity. In 2005, we formed a new task force to actually discuss reparations and restitution. In 2007, we passed an apology for slavery. And in 2008, we elected Eugene Taylor Sutton as Bishop of Maryland, the first African-American bishop in this diocese. So there aren't any shortcuts, and trying to find the truth is difficult. Not this past E-News, but the one before that, I wrote an article which outlined all the steps we've taken, you know, from the 50s onwards and how we got to this point. So it's ongoing. Many parishes have still not even taken first steps in trying to come to some understanding of their own problems and their own ways they have benefited from slavery and racism. But we're hoping that more will follow. And, you know, our archives is fantastic. We have wonderful resources, and many dioceses don't have that resource. Many dioceses don't have any kind of archives, and they have no archivist. So we are very, very fortunate to have the resources we do. And hopefully other dioceses can learn from our journey, and other parishes will step up and start the hard work of looking at their own past and figuring out their future. And, you know, I could go on and on, but I won't. I will let you ask any questions. I'm not sure I can answer them all, but I will be glad to try. So if anybody has a question or a comment, let me know.
You want us to raise our hand?
Sure, go ahead, Anne.
Well, Mary, as you know, because I come to you frequently when I'm thinking about something about African Americans, and back in, I think 2013, although it may have been as recently as 2015, I wrote a paper about the Levitt development of Bowie, or Bel Air in Bowie, which William Levitt absolutely refused to sell to African Americans until April 1968, when finally he very grudgingly, as a way to honor Dr. King, said that he would open his houses to African Americans. But in the summer of 1963, in addition to the Martin Luther King, the march and King's speech, there was an Episcopal priest living at Bel Air his name was Reinhard B. Gutman, and he was there trying to support Carl Gregory, who was one of the African Americans. He was a member of what we would now know as the Office of Management and Budget. He was staff there. He wanted to buy a house, and Levitt was refusing to do that. And Gutman led a protest of 17 Episcopal priests who were in the Washington, D.C. area, I think, because Bishop Creighton, William Creighton, had not the Creighton we know, but his dad, was asking Episcopal priests to come and join the march. And there was a whole section of that, or you know, a whole part of that march where the Episcopal Church had a real presence. So I'm a little confused to hear that Bishop Dahl was told he couldn't go, and were priests allowed to go, or did they just, are you allowed to sneak off? Well, with all due respect to Bob.
Well, I'm sure clergy could go. The reason I think Bishop Powell didn't want Bishop Dahl to go was because he was his suffragan bishop.
Mm.
And there were clergy who went on that march. But I think he did not want to open that kettle of fish with the bishop's office. Do you agree, Bishop Elof?
Yeah.
Yeah, I assume, I was going to add a little codicil to that. I was in seminary at that time, and I was planning to go to the march. And the evening before the buses were to leave from Cambridge, Massachusetts, for both Harvard Divinity School and Episcopal Divinity School, my bishop in Connecticut called to say that if I got on that bus, he would see to it that I was never ordained. He was a Virginian, and his rationale, supposedly, I think a lot of this was some racial prejudice on his part, but his rationale was that seminarians should be hitting their books and not being involved in public protests. And the whole reason I had gone to the seminary I went to was because it was the only seminary in our church that saw a relationship between the gospel and the protests. But I wasn't able to go. I decided there was only one sane thing to do, and that was to cancel
Yeah.
going.
Well, of course, Jonathan Daniels was a seminarian when he died.
Right. And he was in the class ahead of me. I knew Jonathan. So.
And I think I should point out there is he was a seminarian, but he had left the seminary to go do this work. So there's this whole tension at that time among people who are clergy as well as seminarians, over which bishops have enormous power.
Although Jonathan left with the graces of the seminary.
Yes.
He and another student who was in my class, Judith Upham, both got permission from the faculty and the blessing of the faculty to go and spend a semester doing voter registration in Haney County, which at the time had a huge Black population, relatively small white population, but almost no Black people were registered to vote at that time. And that's where John was gunned down in August.
Right.
Judith would have been at risk also, but she had been called back to her diocese for some special interview things with the Commission on Ministry. So she had left the week before.
And she eventually was ordained and was a priest in the Diocese of Washington.
That's right.
Yeah, I knew her. It was a complicated time. I mean, there is a biography by Ken Kesselis of John Hines, which speaks, the biggest chapter in that is on that convention in which the demand was made for reparations. And it's what we know is that the sort of tense history in the Episcopal Church is that we'll have an activist presiding bishop followed by a quieter, less active presiding bishop, followed by, it was boomerang back and forth. Yeah.
Well, John Hines, who was the presiding bishop during this 69 special convention, had been roommates with Harry Lee Dahl. So they were very close friends. And Dahl wanted to support him as much as he could. And so that had a lot to do with he said he saw this money as seed money to help promote positive actions in the African American community. But the Diocese of Maryland was not ready to talk about reparations in 1969.
Dan Pontius notes in the chat, this was also Bishop Powell who had dedicated the Jackson and Lee Confederate Monument in Wyman Park in 1948 too.
That's right.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I think there were, it sounds, Bob, you're bishop, and it seems like they all had sort of ties to the old Confederacy, frankly. No matter what they were saying were their motivations at the time.
Well, I
except-
think
Go ahead, Mary.
I just thought that's one reason I thought the Claggett Camp and Conference Center exchange between Powell and the woman who wrote was kind of surprising to me, because he was from Alabama and he was a conservative, and
Mhm.
but that just shows you how complicated people are. You know, it's too easy to use a huge paintbrush and say this one's X and this one's Y. People are very complicated. I mean, Powell did not back away either. Church, Home, and Hospital was owned by the diocese, and all the clergy in the diocese received free care at Church, Home, and Hospital, except if you were Black.
Right.
Then the diocese paid for them to go to a different hospital. But in the 60s, they wanted to integrate, and the staff just had a conniption. And Powell said, sorry, you got to do it. So there's another instance where he did step up.
I was just going to say that as a New Englander, I have been amazed at how progressive many of my predecessors were here in Maryland,
Mhm.
especially since I know a lot of the history of Connecticut and Massachusetts dioceses, and they fancy themselves to be so progressive. But in this period, there was a lot of segregation and a lot of fighting. School integration did not go well in the Boston area. So things are not always what they seem, but I'm very proud of the fact that so many of my predecessors were really quite outspoken, not just on this issue, but on this issue, actually. David Layton was at a meeting to talk about integration in Harford County. He was at Bel Air at Emmanuel. And as he was speaking, the police came up onto the stage and whispered in his ear that they were escorting him out of the county immediately, because the word that they had received was that the KKK was laying a trap for him to attack him on his way back to Baltimore. And so he was forced to leave the meeting. I mean, he is also the bishop who burned his draft card on the steps of the City Hall here in Baltimore. Now, he was much too old to be drafted, but that wasn't the point. The point was that he was anti-Vietnam War. So we've had a long history of progressive bishops.
Mark, you had a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just had and thank you so much, Mary, for walking through so much of the historical detail. And I have not read your article, and I really look forward to doing so.
Good.
I wanted to go back just to, because you were covering so much so quickly. You mentioned 1969, and I think did you say something about a reparations fund or a $200,000?
Mhm.
Was it a resolution? Was that actual money that was put into a fund? And what became
Yes.
of that? That's a lot of money in 1969 terms, and I'm just curious, what was the legacy of that?
That was passed by, excuse me, General Convention, and $200,000 was put into a General Convention special fund. And I tried to track that down, where it went after it was assigned, but I really could never find who it went to. I mean, in the resolution, it was to go to a group that was definitely associated with Foreman. But I don't know if it ever got to them, or I couldn't follow the money. I couldn't follow it. So that's another chore for somebody one of these days, to figure out where that money actually ended up,
Thank you. I was just thinking about that in particular because of the recent news having to do with the actual use of reparation funds here in Baltimore in some of our fellow parishes, something very concrete. And
Yes.
those who have gone beyond the work of just this of discussing reparations and reconciliation and coming to a moral stance on it, to actually doing concrete action, and just very, very curious on how we can become involved in that kind of concrete action now that it moves from consciousness to reality in doing something.
Well, of course, in the diocese, one of the biggest reactions to this is Sutton Scholars,
Yep.
which is a high school program to teach high school students soft skills and lead them through high school and prepare them for the world. And that has been getting a lot of traction, and a lot of people have been asking to donate that specifically to Sutton Scholars for the benefit of these African American high school students.
Jean Law raises, was it CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, which James Foreman was head of, that the money
I don't
went
know.
to? We don't know.
I don't know. If you can look through General Convention journals and all the complicated money stuff, maybe you could follow it, but I couldn't.
Other questions for Mary?
Mary, I was having an email discussion with Rob about Clover Hill,
Mhm.
and my feeling that Lord, I can't think of the people's name, but the people who owned it,
Merriman.
yeah, the Merrimans, that the Merrimans owned a lot of land. They owned land down where Sparrows Point is, and you can't own that much land in the 17th and 18th centuries and not have slaves working. So what evidence, maybe evidence isn't the right word, but do you know anything about Clover Hill? And I know it was a farm, so I'm assuming, since it was farmed until 1869, that it was farmed, the labor was slave labor rather than free.
Sarah, didn't you do some work on that?
I did. So Anne, in answer to your question, there were two branches of the Merriman family, a couple of different brothers. One went north into the county and had larger holdings. And it's very clear in the census reports that their slave holdings were much more significant than the branch of the family that lived at Clover Hill. However, there are slaves that are listed in the census registry. And I was curious about, I did this work in the summer of 2019, and some of you know about this. But I was curious about where the slaves might have been interred and where the family was interred. And because there was a Merriman widow who was the last Merriman owner, it passed out of her hands in 1869. It had an intermediate owner and then was purchased by the guy who owned the son, whose name is, anyway.
I know who you mean.
But in order to, it looked like to raise funds, she sold off land that they had, I think it was 11 acres to the north of what we now call Bishop's Lane. And that went up into, what's now Guilford. But the maps of that track indicate that probably kind of right across the street, maybe the third Georgian Center Hall Colonial down the street, was built on the site of the family graveyard. Those so then my next question was, who was interred there? And I know that one tradition is that, and you can see this up at Hampton in Towson, is that the white members of a family would be buried within a, wrought iron fence or a little wall, and the Black slaves would be buried around the periphery. So those graves were disinterred prior to the sale of the land. So then I went to Greenmount Cemetery records, and indeed, of all terrible times, January 30th, 1869, 13 individuals were reinterred from the Merriman Clover Hill property at Greenmount Cemetery. I talked to the archivist there. She went back through the card catalog. Unfortunately, it does not list the individuals' names that were disinterred from the family holdings and reinterred. There was most of the slaves were not named also in the census reports. There was a 14-year-old girl who was listed as, they have 3 columns on the census, black, white, and M for mulatto. She was listed as a mulatto, I think that was in the 1860 last census before the sale. And there's a possibility that there is a grave, the names don't exactly match, at Greenmount in a different part of the cemetery than the 13 individuals. And it's possible that that is her. I think the difference, I'd have to go back through my notes. It was like in one place her name was listed, say, as Victoria, and in somewhere else, Vicky. Was it the same individual? Unclear. So indeed, the Merrimans did have slaves. Not many of them were named. Each of the censuses shows less than a handful, 3 to 5. And I think it was probably the Baltimore County side of the family whose holdings were much more dependent upon slave labor. But slaves worked the land, absolutely, for decades where we attend church. Absolutely true.
The proof of it is that the garage that was erected in 1905 was erected from stones from the slave quarters. So the slave quarters were on the property when Bishop Perrett bought the land, and under Bishop Perrett, the garage was built. And there's been some talk of maybe the garage ought to be extended and become some kind of museum or something to honor that part of the history.
I think it would be fascinating to do any kind of archaeological work, because trash middens have all kinds of interesting stuff in them. And, on those original maps, it says barn, outbuilding, and then over across the street, the cemetery. But I think it would be fascinating to see what's in the dirt.
Yes.
So with that, I do need to call us to a halt. Exactly. I want to thank again Mary for her enormous work and her continuing work on this. And obviously, this has been an important conversation for us all. So let's look at possibly having it again, is my response to that. Thank you, Dan, for the particular information. Thank you, Ruth, for the detailed information you've both provided in the chat room. And I need to let you all go to church. So Bishop, would you bless us as we go to church?
Go forth in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.